So we're going to look at Shakespeare's The Tempest today, and I think Shakespeare's last play. No, the last play is A Winter's Tale, but it's towards the end of his career as a playwright, dramatist. It's still a romance. So if you look in the designations of the types of plays, it is under those called romances. Romances are marked by the miraculous, but also they're episodic in the sense that they're not trying to portray the grand narrative of a whole cosmological worldview the way we would see in an epic, for example. So when we're discussing genre, and we're talking about comedies and tragedies, those are both to be found in the classical era as types of dramatic productions. History is less so, but Shakespeare introduces them, which I think is interesting in and of itself. In his histories, he also often presents whole series of historical plays. So, and to be seen concurrently, to portray the march of God's providence through under different kings. So, you know, the saying, the king is dead, long live the king. The enduring work of God despite the rise and fall of kings. So Richard II is followed by Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and then Henry V. The four plays together are the Henriad. You can see that he does this at various times in his history plays. And to some degree, he introduces history plays as a significant historical or literary genre, in part because of the teaching of Scripture, I would argue. Because Scripture is organized historically, chronologically, and it depicts the exact same thing that I said characterizes his representation of the classical drama in the forms of comedies and tragedies. Comedies conclude with marriages, and tragedies with the malefactors all being punished and given their just deserts, so that in all cases, divine justice is revealed. And he'll do the same thing in his history plays. But by taking the longer scope over a series of plays, Shakespeare illustrates that more vividly. But remember, history is the venue of God's providence where it can be seen. And here in The Tempest, he reflects, and that's why I included it here. In past years, I have not always taught The Tempest. I taught yet another one of the four tragedies. And I still go back and forth on it. I'd like to include them all. But the reason I've included this is the play that is chiefly about the theater, more than any of the others, I would say. It's a regular feature of Shakespeare's drama that he has plays within the plays. He presents dramaturge figures, and we have one here again in the form of Prospero. We have the staging and the directing that take place by the dramaturge figure to a certain outcome, the outcome always being benign, providential, although we have anti-dramaturge figures that lurk in the scenes. Caliban being one such figure. He tries to be, at any rate. He's not very good at it, but he tries to subvert Prospero. You could argue there were others in the play as well. But all of it is a reflection on the theater, and the theater as a microcosm of life. And so Shakespeare regularly is talking about not just the theater, but of the responsibility of the dramatist as teacher within the context of the theater. And the teachers that he represents are usually political rulers. So therefore, the responsibility of the kings, the princes, the magistrates, of lawfully ordering their realms. And we saw that in Measure for Measure, that was a significant feature of Measure for Measure, that the aim of the Duke from withdrawing from the civic life of Vienna was to bring about justice from the background and to teach all of the characters something about themselves in the process. And I talked about the different features of the law, functions of the law, and introduced the idea, the threefold use of the law that was very much of a Reformation standby, but has sadly fallen into almost ignorance in our day. Even in Christians talking about the law, they don't seem to realize that the law has multiple functions. One of them is to restrain evil, but that's only one. It has a didactic function as well, and it even has a Christological function as far as it points people to Christ. You can't get that if you're not in a Christian country with Christian laws. So it has a gospel function, if you will. So there's a reason why you want Christian nationalism is all the rage right now, discussion about it. It's usually used just as a word to attack people with, to insinuate all sorts of totalitarianism. And it could perhaps issue in that direction, but I think broadly speaking, under that umbrella, you could include what Shakespeare is trying to speak of. And certainly all of his contemporaries would agree with the idea of having a more Christian commonwealth would be good for one and all. And the laws would be one of the means by which you would try and orchestrate that outcome. And the dramaturge figure, that is the ruler, would seek to do that. Now, in the figure of Prospero, we'll see a similar such figure. And I wanted to look at this play for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because of the way it portrays the native, the indigenous, the cannibal. Because the figure Caliban is an anagram of cannibal. And there is a reading in our day that has sympathy with the cannibal, with the indigenous, with the native. And there's a type of reading of Shakespeare's plays. I said to you, Shakespeare's plays are, or did I say this? And if I recapitulate something that I said, forgive me for this, but I'm not sure I did. Shakespeare's plays used to be basically the assumed foundation of English literary culture. Everyone who would be taught English would read Shakespeare in high school. I was, a play a year. And it was accepted as a part of English-speaking people's identity that they would read Shakespeare as part of their education. And that was so uncontroversial that in a program in the UK called Desert Island Discs, they would interview, I don't know if it still continues, but it was certainly going on for at least 30 years. The host would interview a celebrity of some sort, a politician, a celebrity, a sportsman, an athlete, any sort of, a wide variety of characters, a musician onto the island, and ask them to play or to name their 6 favorite musical tracks and what it meant to them. And then at the end of that, they would say, well, in addition to the Bible and the works of Shakespeare, what other book would you want on your desert island? Because it's just you on the desert island. You've got the music, you've got the Bible, you've got Shakespeare, what else do you want on it? And I did occasionally hear somebody say, I don't want the Bible on my island because because I'm an atheist and I don't believe that falsehood should be a part of my world, that sort of thing. But I never heard anyone reject Shakespeare, ever, because everyone appreciated Shakespeare. And in Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which we studied in first year, Brave New World is taken from this very play, The Tempest, that term. And it's an ideal state is intended by this. And in Brave New World, Huxley is assuming that his audience knows the reference of those 3 words, Brave New World, and its reference to The Tempest and Shakespeare's works. And in fact, one of the things about Huxley's Brave New World is that the savages, as they're called, read the works of Shakespeare. And the denizens of the state in which the civilized people work and live and have their being, they've never read Shakespeare, haven't heard of Shakespeare, and aren't interested in Shakespeare. They're interested in bodily pleasures alone, material concerns. They've been conditioned and hatched from birth, the alphas and the betas and the gammas they've all been conditioned to have their senses gratified, but they've never been taught any culture whatsoever, whereas the savages have, and they've read this book even. And of course the savages are like the Calibans then. So he's drawing and comparing and contrasting the Brave New World of the dystopian future from Shakespeare's understanding of these things. And again, if you've never read Shakespeare's Brave New World, then you're not even going to understand what Huxley's trying to do here. Again, one of the benefits of a classical education is having read certain core foundational texts to pick up the interaction between different authors and different works of literature, and then being caught up in the conversation then. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this here. But again, you could do this for a wide variety of Shakespeare's plays, the same sort of analysis. But I think this one's particularly potent because of the emphasis certainly in the last 50 years, that Caliban and the native has been badly treated and mistreated and colonized. And among other things, he is, although he's called a devil, he's actually the hero of the play. And Prospero is a colonizer and a white man and the bad guy. That's the reading in the past 50 years. And it is intensified over the course of time, such that it would be very difficult for people on stage now to represent Caliban the way Shakespeare would have presented him and intended him to be understood without the audience going crazy, because they have been conditioned to read culture, Western culture and Western civilization, and indeed the interaction between the Christian Western European world and the natives of this country, say, as anything other than an act of colonization and oppression. That's what we're all taught in school. And that, as I say, that's intensified in recent times, since I guess probably the mid-'80s, when I was in university. It's intensified. Now, initially, I would have read it, and I think the standard view, and Frank Kermode writes a really good introduction in edition of the Shakespeare's Tempest. In 1954, he brings out an edition of the Arden works of Shakespeare, and he presents something like the view that I would say is the standard reading of Shakespeare, or it was. And that is basically a fusion of classical and Christian ideas, engaging with the material culture of the New World. And so I'm going to try and, to begin with, present that contrast and give them a sort of a representation, because in teaching Shakespeare's play, we are engaging with the play, but we're also engaging with how a play is read. We're going to read it on its own terms. I always insist on that, so we'll get to the text. But I want to frame it as a contrast between two ways of reading the text. One of them a materialist view, which is all the rage now under colonialism, and which bleeds into Marxism, invariably, and an idealist view, a classical and Christian tradition, a symbolic view of reading the text. So when we see Shakespeare doing a play about the theater, which I think it's pretty obvious he's commenting on the theater and the dramaturge figures in it and what he does. Do we understand that as an act of aggression and an act of violence and an act of injustice, or do we understand it as the opposite, as a godly ordering of life, instituting laws that restrain good or empower good and restrain evil, in order to teach on stage how culture ought to be used to improve nature? Because not all nature is good. So that's the first thing I need to introduce into our discussion here, the idea of nature that we bring to the text. And the idea of nature that we bring to the text is the romantic idea of nature. So since the Romantic period, late 19th or early 19th century, late 18th century, the term nature has taken on a different connotation than any age before it, in the sense that nature is now seen to be something unambiguously good. Whatever is natural is good. Whatever is artificial, by contrast, is the exact opposite. It's bad. It's a restraint on nature. It has the connotations of unnatural. It's strongly emphasized. It's most advertisements play on this all the time, and popular culture will play on the idea of doing what you do out of natural impulses must be good for you. So food, which I give you that's natural or organic, it's another way of saying natural, is per necessity healthy and good for you. Whereas what's artificial, if I gave you something to eat and here's something natural and here's something artificial, what would you like to eat? You're going to pick natural every time, of course, understandably so. But artificial just seems doesn't necessarily have to have an antithetical relation to nature. The use of artifice or of technology can be used to perfect nature so that nature becomes better. In other words, it immediately introduces the question of how do we human beings relate to what we call nature? Do we let nature be natural? As in, we don't involve ourselves at all. The radical green environmentalist movement teaches that. What we need to do is leave nature alone. Nature is seen as an organism, and we are seen as a virus on that organism. We're corrupting nature by our very breathing. We exude, I hesitate to say it, carbon dioxide, the thing that feeds the plants. That's what we breathe out. And that is destroying the world, so it is said. Even though carbon dioxide, as I say, the more carbon dioxide you give, the healthier the green stuff on the planet is, because that's what plants consume. They require light, they require carbon dioxide. When you give it that, then the world gets greener, gets more productive, and you can feed more people as a result of that. But if you regard carbon dioxide as a poisonous element, which it is if you and I breathe it in great quantities, but if plants breathe it, they're doing better. But that idea is deeply embedded in our culture because of influences of the environmental movement, often fallacious ones. And concomitant with that, then, the very idea of humanity, human culture, is seen as somehow contradicting the goodness of the order of things already there. So we want to minimize our carbon footprints, but also the advance of artifice. Techne, culture, it sees nature, in other words, as threatened by culture, irrespective of the form. It's just nature good, culture bad. That dichotomy. Nature oppressed, culture oppressor. Very sharp dichotomy between the two. And doesn't get into the question, are there such things as negative cultures and positive cultures? It's just, no, all culture is bad. And the best cultures then are the least cultivated, the most natural, the closest to nature. That's the romantic portrait of it, by the way. The noble savage, the child. Those that are closest to nature, the least educated, the least rational and orderly in their understanding of the engagement of humanity and culture. Those are what we see as exemplary. We want to be closer to nature. And that's the beginning of what I will call post-humanism. It begins as an anti-humanism, and it bleeds into what we'll call post-humanism. I'll talk about that in my lit theory class next semester. Significant feature of contemporary life is this turn against humanity, which is very much a feature of our own age and of no age before us, really. It's a very recent development. But in terms of Shakespeare's play here, let me present, first of all, the view of it that I would have taken. And it's the one that Frank Kermode represents. By the way, Frank Kermode is one of the two authors of the Literary Guide to the Bible, I think, along with Robert Alter and Frank Kermode. I can't remember the exact title of the book. But he has a strong classical education and Christian education, understands the Bible as the one of the foremost, if not the, in fact, he'd argue the foremost influence on the culture of the West. The most. And he sees it as a good thing. Just like those who, on the BBC, presented desert island discs. So we're going to have the Bible on that desert island, just like Prospero's Island, where there's nobody else there. It's just you and the books and the music that you have with you. You've got the Bible, you've got the works of Shakespeare. What else do you want in there? So he will fall within that tradition, the tradition which I think we all fall into, even if we're now in a culture that's opposed to it. So he will see the play, Shakespeare's The Tempest, as a recapitulation of ideas from the classical and Christian tradition. And insofar as it relates to that history, it also has conscious literary and aesthetic traditions. And those fit with the period in question, within the period that we call the Renaissance. So we will see it as an interaction with, among other things, works by Machiavelli, the Prince. It's going to engage in political theory. What's the ideal form of politics? How does a politician act? How ought he not to act? So there's all sorts of political discussions in the play. Also, and I think I mentioned it, Michel de Montaigne, in his essays, writes a work on cannibalism, which Shakespeare, I don't know if Shakespeare had read it, but it sounds like he had. And it's certainly roughly contemporary with this. But certainly, in terms of contemporaneity, this play is written after the discovery of the New World and reports coming back about the nature of the indigenous peoples and the interactions between the European settlers and those peoples. And there's a lot of discussion in Britain and in France and in Spain about the relation between the Old World and the New World. How do we understand these people? Where did they come from, among other things? Are these the lost tribes of Israel? You know, with the Genesis account of everyone beginning in Adam and Eve, there's no mention of this continent of North America in Scripture, or South America for that matter. Where did the people come from? Exactly. How did they get there? How do we relate to them? Are they human even? There's discussions on that. Very early on you can read Catholic, I think papal accounts of how to treat the natives, and basically it is, these are human beings and you should share the gospel with them. They're made in the image and likeness of God. They should receive God's grace and truth as an act of charity, just like we would to anyone else. We're not to regard them as anything other than human beings. You must not exploit them. You must not mistreat them. You must educate them. Show compassion on them. That's early. And I would say that general sentiment holds all the way up into the now very controversial residential schools episode. And I don't want to weigh into all of that, but because that's a firestorm in itself right now. But that's certainly a part of the whole residential schools thing. It's an aspect of it, at any rate. It does go rather in a very malign and troubling direction later in the 20th century. But the initial thing, I think, is basically a missionary type activity with benign intentions, or at least you could see that. But of course, there's always sin wherever people are involved, including Christians. But so that's how I would read this, and I see the play as a reflection of these traditions and engagement with texts that are concurrent with Shakespeare's own day. And there will be differences in the play, among other things, in the contrast between white magic and black magic. That's in the play. And by white and black, he's not referring to the color of the people. It's a type of magic. Definitions of nobility, but not in terms of power, but in terms of virtue. Shakespeare is very clear about nobility residing in virtue and virtue in goodness then, and not in, just rank. There are all sorts of cosmological correspondences that he traces out. There is theories of allegory, and again, I talked about the genre of romance, which is part of every edition of Shakespeare. It's put in that genre that we call romance, where there's an idealization of life in some ways, and supernatural influence is very much a part of the genre. So it's written in that genre of literature. That's a classical genre-based definition. And so we have something in this play like a tragicomedy. It doesn't fit the tragedy, it doesn't fit the comedy. It's sort of in between, a bit like Measure for Measure was. Because remember, although the tone of Measure for Measure is pretty dark, it ends in a marriage. Proposal of marriage at any rate. So it ends well. Not everyone dies. Thanks to the dramaturge figure of the Duke, the potential tragedy is averted and justice is restored. So it's a comedy, but it's a tragedy comedy because it's not a full-blown comedy. And the Tempest is likewise. There's a marriage at the end. And even more than a marriage, there is a mask. Let me write this on the board, because it's a type of ball, dance, reflection of the divine dance in the Trinity, that is performed by nobility in Shakespeare's day. It's a courtly type of dance with which the play concludes. Shakespeare writes a play called Comus, a Mask, about 35 years later, 30-something years later. It's a type of drama in which dance is performed, and at this stage, when Shakespeare is writing it, it's performed by royalty. And he concludes the play with that. So all these are contemporary topical references, and likewise the references to the New World make it obviously that any classical engagement with ideas is going to talk about the historical circumstances and the ideas related to them that Shakespeare is engaging with. Now, I say that because the view I'm going to present is one that other Shakespeare scholars, critics, will not present anymore, and they will go hard in the materialist direction. So rather than the idealist in the sense of presenting ideas, they will go in the materialist direction and present the play as a demonstration of power relations. And in fact, the position that I've just articulated, that Frank Kermode represents and that I represent, they will see as a way of disguising economic and social relationships. It's something that the bourgeoisie does. They represent things to draw our focus away from what really is going on in the play. So a materialist reading of the play is going to talk about the social and political and especially the economic conditions involved in the whole assessment, and power relations that occur as a result. And that particularly gets intensified in our age because of the influence of Michel Foucault, who is the foremost influence amongst the Shakespeare scholars that we'll call queer theorists, because Michel Foucault himself was homosexual and engages at the materialist cultural engagement levels repeatedly. And according to that reading, Caliban, whom I and Kermode, and I think Shakespeare, sees as a sexually lustful and savage, devilish character, he gets represented as a misunderstood and abused character. He doesn't represent what Edmund Spenser would have, in his Legend of Chastity, presented as the wild man, a wild man untamed, uncultivated. He doesn't represent that, something that needs to be restrained and needs to be put in place, and a representation of the passionate side of human nature. He doesn't need to be treated the way Prospero does. On the contrary, he needs to be liberated. And the oppression that he receives from Prospero needs to be highlighted because it reflects the oppression of the indigenous peoples of North America at the hands of the European colonizers. So they don't see him as a representative of certain illicit desires in human nature. They see him as a representative of nature, and nature is good. And therefore, if you oppress nature, you're evil. So it's the colonizer, the Prosperos, the Mirandas that are the evil. The whites are evil. And Caliban, who is a dark figure, is actually the good character, despite Shakespeare's intentions in the play. And that account will present, and I'm going to give their presentation now, not mine, will see him as a socially disadvantaged character. In his own words, a savage and deformed slave, deprived of human dignity, forced into menial activities, and enslaved for the purposes of punishment and exploitation. In other words, he's a type of the African slave that was used during the 18th century, particularly in the United States in the African slave trade. He's a prototype of that, even though this is 2 centuries before that. Right? And I think that's easy. I suspect people, when they read it, they were a little bit, how do I see this character? What do I do with him? And I feel, I don't think Shakespeare intends this, but there's something about this that leaves me deeply uncomfortable. The character, the way he's being treated, and he's treated rather harshly, it must be said. Prospero's threats towards him are hard to stomach. It sounds like he's going to be cruel to him. He's threatening him. And how do we read that interaction and the power dynamic there? And as I say, his name is an anagram, Caliban, of cannibal. And in Montaigne's work of cannibals, which I read in 4th year university, by the way. I don't think anybody reads Montaigne anymore. His essays are very good, by the way, alongside Bacon's. Excellent. Very influential as a form. We get the form of the essay, by the way, from this period. An essay is not a classical literary form. You're all asked to write essays in university as a way of disciplining your minds, articulating arguments, presenting thoughts in a uniform and persuasive fashion. It's not an ancient literary form. It emerges in it's a Renaissance form. And it means a trial. An essay is a trial. And basically it's a thought experiment. Let me try out this idea. Maybe it'll fail, but let me try the idea. And if you read Montaigne's essays, you'll see that so it's of cannibals. He'll talk about everything related to cannibals. He'll include the classical tradition. He'll talk about biblical ideas. He'll talk about contemporary situations, and he'll write an extended reflection on that just to come to a conclusion on the basis of everything he says up to that point. Francis Bacon does exactly the same thing in his essays, which I recommend to you. Francis Bacon's essays are excellent, very interesting, informed by classical style unlike our own essays. Exemplary in some ways. But Montaigne argues that the European newcomers, when they came to the New World, they were initially treated with hospitality, and they were treated in a very friendly fashion. And just like the natives of this country did when the European settlers came. But over the course of time, there was a conflict there, and bad things resulted from that, and there were interactions and that's basically the portrait of Caliban as Shakespeare presents it. And he is thereby robbed of his dignity and not allowed to have his own religious practices, etc. He's robbed of his own magic. He complains about that. Prospero has his magic. As long as he has his books and his magic, then I will not have any power here, even though I'm indigenous to this land. And Shakespeare's going to question that, by the way, because Sycorax, his mother, doesn't come from the place either. Sycorax, the witch, comes from another place, and only later she settled, but she just happened to get there before Prospero. And but again, the narrative goes that this falls into the story of subjugation through technology, which is commonly told by in Marxist accounts. And so the result of that is that the native, and this is how Shakespeare portrays him as well, at first receives him as in the settler with welcome, and then later, because he loses his power, also loses his dignity, gets drunk, and even worships the settler. That's the portrait here. But the pivotal event in the materialist account of Caliban gives a very different take on the pivotal event which causes Prospero to throw him in jail. And what is that event? The attempt of Caliban to rape Miranda, his daughter. That's when it turns on Caliban. They used to have friendly relations. And Caliban doesn't deny this. He affirms that he not only tried to do that, but wishes that he'd succeeded, because if he'd succeeded, he would have peopled the island with Calibans. But he sought to rape the young girl. That's when Prospero turns on him. The materialist account tends to ignore that because, again, it wants to present this as exploiter and exploited, and to see only guilt on one side and innocence on the other, because, again, it's a portrait of the natural and the powerful. As I say, he doesn't even try and deny it. So in Act 1, Scene 2, I'll get to this in a second when we read the play. Act 1, Scene 2, 348 to 350, he actually admits this exact thing from Caliban's own mouth. Now, in the idealist readings, or the historically Christian informed readings, this is the reason and the justification for treating Caliban here. He represents bestial lust. He represents illicit action. He represents savagery. Whereas Miranda represents noble chastity. She's a beautiful, noble character. And how do we legally treat illicit action and noble action? Well, you reward one and you sanction the other. That's how you do it. You have to apply the law in that case. That's all Prospero is doing. He's justly imposing the law to restrain evil and to demonstrate what good character is. And Miranda's name is literally to be admired. That's what Miranda means. She's an admirable young woman who her father is devoted to and wants to protect. Again, but the materialist account sees it very differently. There's a racist pattern, and they will say it doesn't matter what Caliban ever did, he was always going to be oppressed by Prospero, and he would never have allowed Caliban to marry his daughter, which we can't speak to that because there's no mention of it in the text, but we are told that Prospero tried to educate Caliban. He even taught him his speech. He was teaching him his religion. He was teaching him his ways. He was trying to make him, in other words, he was treating him like a son or a daughter. That's how he did, until he found that he was unwilling to do this. And not only unwilling in the sense of lacking the natural capacities to, but the moral nature in him rebelled against it. He didn't want to be a good character. He wanted evil. And at that point, he gives up on him. So it's a very different reading here. So the materialist account is that Caliban is an oppressed figure, and Prospero's designation of him is simply his perspective. The idea that he's the son of a devil and a witch, well, that's from his perspective. He just does this to dehumanize Caliban. We have no other source of information for it. So, of course, this is exactly, this is the victor pronouncing his victory by presenting his narrative and ignoring all other actions. Well, except we're told other things in the play, I would say. Do you have a comment here or a question?
Yeah, you kind of reminded me of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Because,
yes.
Because the one of the main characters doesn't want to marry the man that her father would have her marry.
Mm-hmm.
And in this time period, in this context, a good daughter takes very seriously the counsel of her father
Yes.
of who to marry. So it
Yes.
seems that if in any possible world Caliban could marry Prospero's daughter,
Mm-hmm.
that Caliban would have to become the kind of man that Prospero would assent to his daughter marrying.
And there are no other human beings on the island. Remember, there are no other men. So he would have perhaps thought that.
So it almost seems that Prospero is actually doing the work to make Caliban into the sort of person who could possibly marry
Making to his ideal son-in-law. I think that's correct. I think that's how I would see it. And that's how I would read it. He never says that, but it makes sense. Now, back to that play, though, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's slightly different than this because the ruler of Athens is disordered, and so is the father in that case. He wants to marry that guy because I said so, right? It's not because he's better. He doesn't make an argument that he's superior. He just says, but I will it, and I'm your father, so therefore, because it's legal, it's right. It's an appeal to the law without an appeal to God's law, without any rectitude. He's not a superior man. It's just, I want you to marry this man. And she says, well, he's no better than this man, and this man is superior because of that. So both parties are wrong in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Everybody's reason is disordered by their willfulness. Mm-hmm. And then it gets ordered, and then it ends well after everything gets... So it's similar and different. Yeah.
And the other thing is, before Caliban is made a slave, literally, he's already a slave.
Naturally.
Because he's a slave to his passions, and he even with all of the help that could be afforded to him, he can't manage to not try to take what he desires in the moment.
Correct.
And
so he
is a slave already.
He's a slave to his passions, he's a slave to his desires, and he has no higher intellectual life nor moral life at that. So in that sense. But for a cultural materialist like the Marxists are, they dismiss that whole realm, the idea of virtue, the idea of that's dismissed out of hand as bourgeois mythology. It's just materialism. Remember, Karl Marx wrote his doctoral thesis on the atomistic philosopher of the pre-Socratic word Democritus. I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but I will say it because it's true. He writes his doctoral thesis on Democritus, whose theory, pre-Socratic philosopher, was that all reality ultimately is atoms, an undividable material substance. In other words, reality ultimately is material in nature. And Karl Marx, tellingly, is very interested in the ideas of a materialist way of looking at life that's going to dismiss any higher ideas of goodness, truth, beauty, justice, etc. And the cultural materialists of our day, likewise, will dismiss any appeals to virtue or higher appeals as just a power move because everything is ultimately a matter of material possession and the power that comes with it. And the power dynamics go with those that possess and control the culture. And language is the means of ordering that, and therefore you have to control language, etc., as Foucault will say.
Marx also said he saw himself in the character of Mephistopheles.
There you go. Sure. Adam.
I see myself as
Oh,
Sorry.
you answered my question.
I did?
Yes.
Okay. So, so the idea even of Sycorax the witch as an evil character, well, that's just from the perspective of a European rival. But if we want to see it in a more even-handed manner, we'll see two religions in conflict here, and Prospero ascribes to one, and her shamanistic characteristics are unjustly being denigrated in the process. And we ought to adopt a more materialist view of religion in which they're all included and they're all effectively equal, except for the one that denies materialism as the basis for all religious claims. That one has to be hunted out of the public square, like Christianity, to say that it's not, there's more than material life and sexual desire that drives our every being, and our whole nature is not a part of our self-identification as this identity or whatever. That's not actually correct. We find our identity in Christ, in whose image we're made. We follow his example, we live in his image, we follow his path. He's a being in his human nature that died and rose 2,000 years ago, but now is also a spiritual being that continues to have the image of God, but we are connected to him spiritually. That whole spiritual realm is dismissed by the cultural Marxists altogether. So they will emphasize the play as a product of its culture, and because we recognize the limitations of that culture, we will want to see this as a colonialist style of engagement with the indigenous peoples. It's just a colonialist tract. And that is how you will see it portrayed on stage, almost certainly. If you go and watch depictions of Shakespeare now, you will find it very difficult to find any that doesn't see it as colonialist versus indigenous. And we're on the side of the indigenous there. Totally misrepresents what Shakespeare's trying to do in the play. Turns it completely on its head. So of course we're not going to teach this in schools, other than as a cautionary tale and everything that's wrong about white people, and white men in particular, and especially dead white males by Shakespeare. So Shakespeare taught in Britain as the centerpiece of culture in California was banned. Shakespeare was banned in California a decade and a half ago, precisely for this reason. That's West Coast. It's different than East Coast. East Coast is closer to Europe and more friendly towards it, but the West Coast of the United States progressive wing is very much aware of the colonialist and the angle, and emphasizes it to such a degree that they'll say that Shakespeare is a racist colonialist apologist. I'm just telling you, that's the reading of it. So I want to read the play, and we're going to read the play, but I wanted you to see it as this is a text, and because Shakespeare is a great author, great authors provoke really strong responses and make the reading of the text a complicated thing and a cultural act and a historical engaged act in a way that I think make it, and you said it wasn't as interesting as Measure for Measure or A Midsummer Night's Dream, and maybe not, but when you introduce all the elements of it, I think, well, actually it's extraordinarily interesting in that sense. It's not just an act of the imagination. It's not just about theater. And now it's about theater engaging with the whole issue of colonialism and all that, because that is the contemporary debate on this. Yes?
I was going to say that even as I was reading the first two acts, I could feel the
You could
effects of that, because I was thinking when I was first introduced to Caliban, I was like, oh, that's a little weird. You know, he's a slave and he's mistreated, and then I saw, oh wait, he's actually not a good person.
Right.
And I was like, you know what? Like, I think even in my mind, I was thinking, is this sort of trying to show that colonialism was right? And then I'm like, oh wait, this guy's one. He's the only person there. So it's not like it's a whole group of people. Two, he tried to rape his daughter. That's
Kind of important.
yeah.
A little bit.
So it's like maybe this guy brought this upon himself. That's what I was thinking.
But again, in the cultural narrative of our day, it's always oppressor and oppressed, and the oppressed are always, like Caliban, dark, and the oppressor is always white. So it's easy for us to see that. And if Shakespeare's doing that, well, then maybe he's presenting a narrative of white guy good, black guy bad. Right? They're very simple. Those are the ways in which a cultural Marxist always presents things. It's a black and white issue. It's just what was white is black and what's black is white. It just invert them. And thereby we're doing justice in the reading of the text. This text is too complicated to allow that sort of simplistic reading.
Something I dislike about, like, even when I was teaching in high school, a lot of times how they explain something, I'm like, that's such a way to reduce everything to just one thing. It's like nothing else in this field matters. That's kind of annoying.
Yeah, so even though last year you were with me for Brave New World, I didn't talk about this text. I didn't talk about Shakespeare. I didn't talk about the cultural colonialist aspect. I might have mentioned it ever so slightly, in the sense that here we have the people that are the savages, called the savages, that are in the places that are not regulated by the state, and they read Shakespeare. I didn't get into it too much because in first year university, I don't want to introduce you to politics of I want you to read texts and appreciate them. But eventually we have to engage with how our culture is, it's not just reading the text and understanding it, but how are we interpreting the text and what are the options here for us? And to start to assess and evaluate them. And then you come to your own conclusions on the right way to read it and what we should conclude from it. But I don't think it allows for a simplistic reading of Caliban's a good guy, and in fact, I think it's quite clear in Shakespeare's view that Caliban is a wicked character, but not because he's black, and not because he's a slave or he's subhuman, because otherwise he doesn't teach him, and he doesn't seek to teach him his language and teach him a moral way of relating to the world. He just doesn't do those things. He's trying to be beneficent to him, and then only then, when he seeks to rape his daughter, he says, I can't allow that to happen. And then the shipwreck happens. But we'll talk about the influence of the shipwreck and all of these things and the providential ordering of things. That's a very interesting aspect of the whole play as well. Adam, do you want to say one more thing? I'm going to take a break after this, and then we'll.
No, go ahead.
Okay, no, I'm going to take a break after this. So yes,
Yeah.
because then when we come to the play, we find that the play, although it's about the play, and it's about the stage, and about theater in general, it has an outside to the theater, in the sense that events happen beyond Prospero's influence in some ways, although he brings about the shipwreck. It's his art that brings about the shipwreck. But we don't have the sense that Prospero is akin to the figure that we meet in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He doesn't seem to have earth-encompassing power. It's called magic. It is limited in its scope. It doesn't seem to have supernatural. It's a natural or a human, artfully utilized power. And once his cousin's vessel comes in the orbit of his island, then he wrecks it in order to bring other men to the island, one of whom he wants to marry his daughter. It's all about getting your daughter married. It's not only about that, but he wants his daughter to have a husband so that she can have a fulfilled life. And thus far he's had Caliban to work with, and that's it. And oh gosh, that guy's not going to be impossible. I need somebody else in the mix here. And then the old enmity between him and his brother is going to have to be settled. Even though his brother treated him unjustly, he's going to have to settle up with his brother to rectify all the wrongs, and he's going to marry his daughter to his brother's son. Right? Lots of stuff going on in the play. Cousin marriage, yeah. We won't get into all that sort of stuff.
I mean, they're nobles. That's what they do.
Yes, it is what they do. It's unfortunate. But anyway, But we'll get into all that. We'll get into the political aspect of it and the ideal city-state. I mentioned, what's his name? Machiavelli's The Prince. We would also want to consider Sir Thomas More's Utopia as a political treatise. We could also talk about Plato's Republic, but I don't think it's as much in view here. He's thinking more of contemporary political treatises. Very much a part of Shakespeare's day, the discussion of Machiavellian approaches to power, which are more like the cultural Marxists, power for the sake of power, as opposed to the idealistic Christian approaches to power, where you don't seek power for the sake of power, you use power for the sake of the promotion of virtue. But we'll get to that after the break then. So that was the